Snow was falling outside the window, soft and soundless, the kind that turned the whole street into a painting. Inside, the house smelled like roasted turkey and cinnamon candles. My mother had gone all out this year. Gold-rimmed plates, silver cutlery, and a table runner embroidered with little holly leaves. She called it a family Christmas to remember. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I sat across from my sister Emily, watching the flicker of the fireplace bounce off her blonde curls. She looked perfect, as always. Pearl earrings, cream-colored sweater dress, the kind of woman who'd never seen a bad lighting angle in her life. Dad poured himself another glass of Cabernet, eyes soft and glossy, his usual look when he was both proud and tired. Mom hovered between the kitchen and the table, arranging napkins that didn't need arranging. She was in her element, talking, showing, performing. So Emily, she said, settling into her chair with that rehearsed excitement, "Tell us again about that magazine interview in Los Angeles. I just love how you said writing is like breathing for you." Emily smiled modestly, though you could see the pleasure flashing in her eyes. "It wasn't a big deal, Mom. Just a local feature." "Oh, don't downplay it," Mom replied quickly. "It's the kind of thing people work their whole lives for. Our little writer finally made it." Dad lifted his glass. To Emily. They all toasted. I joined in smiling because it was easier than explaining why I didn't feel like celebrating. "That's great, Em," I said, my voice steady. "Really?" Her smile tightened just a little. She nodded as if accepting a compliment from an old teacher. Then she leaned back, crossing her legs like someone waiting to be photographed. I cut into the turkey, careful not to scrape the plate, and nodded at all the right times while they kept talking. The conversation flowed around me like background music. I'd learned how to be invisible here, an art form I perfected somewhere between childhood and adulthood. Mom moved on to her favorite topic. "Family pride. You know, when you think about it," she said, slicing another piece of turkey for Dad, "we've been very lucky. 2 daughters, both smart, both independent. Though I have to say, one of you always had a little extra sparkle." Emily laughed, that high-practiced laugh that carried like crystal. "Oh, Mom, stop." I felt the corner of my mouth twitch. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Just tired. Dinner dragged on in that polite, suffocating way only family dinners can. Every time Mom's eyes met mine, I saw a flicker of something. Obligation, maybe guilt. But it passed, quickly replaced by the familiar glaze of performance. When dessert came out, she carried it herself, a pumpkin pie from the bakery down the street, though she always called it her secret family recipe. The scent of nutmeg filled the room. She set it down carefully, the way you'd present an award. "Before we eat," she said, lifting her glass again, "I just want to say how grateful I am this year. For this family, for Emily's courage to chase her dreams, for her creativity, her heart, her talent." Her eyes brushed over me briefly like the beam of a flashlight catching something unimportant. "And for Sarah, of course," she added after a pause, "for being so reliable." Reliable, my least favorite compliment. It was the word people used when they couldn't think of anything else to say. I smiled anyway. "Thank you." The knife in her hand gleamed as she cut into the pie. Steam rose from the slice. Then, with that same steady, casual voice, she said it. "Sometimes," she began, "I wish Emily was our only child. Life would be so much simpler." It landed softly like a whisper, but the air shifted. For a moment no one moved. Then Dad laughed, quiet, awkward, as if trying to erase what he just heard. "Oh, Diane, don't start." Mom shrugged. "I'm just saying. She's easy. She makes things easier." Emily laughed too, shaking her head. "Don't worry, Mom. We love her anyway." The sound of their laughter filled the room, warm and cruel at the same time. I set my fork down slowly. The metal clicked against the plate. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I didn't feel angry. Not even hurt. Just hollow. Like someone had finally spoken a truth I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. I looked around the table. The people I had sent money to when their roof leaked, the same ones who called me responsible, as if that made me disposable. Their faces blurred together under the glow of the Christmas lights. For a second I thought about getting up, about saying something sharp, something that would slice through the laughter like a blade. But instead I exhaled slowly, feeling every ounce of air leave my lungs. "Well," I said quietly, my voice calm and even, "you might just get your wish." The laughter stopped. Mom's hand froze mid-air, the knife hovering over the pie. Emily's smile faltered, though she tried to keep it in place. Dad looked at me confused, but said nothing. The clock on the mantel ticked once, twice. I pushed my chair back and stood up. My napkin slid from my lap to the floor, a small white flag no one cared to pick up. "Sarah," Mom said finally. Her voice soft but empty. "Don't be dramatic." "I'm not," I replied. "I'm just done pretending this feels like home." I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. The room felt smaller as I crossed it. Outside, the snow was still falling, catching the glow of the porch lights like tiny fragments of glass. As I opened the door, the cold air hit my face clean and sharp. I glanced back once, at the golden dining room, the perfect family, frozen mid-silence, their smiles already fading. The Christmas lights twinkled behind me as I stepped out into the snow. They looked warm from the outside, but up close, they buzzed faintly like something about to burn out. And for the first time that night, I realized they didn't dim because I left. They were never that bright to begin with. The road stretched ahead of me in long white silence. Snow whirled under the headlights like scattered dust, and the wipers dragged across the windshield with a slow, tired rhythm. The radio played Silent Night, the melody too soft, too peaceful for the kind of night it was. I let it play anyway. Sometimes irony was the only thing that made sense. The highway between Fort Collins and Boulder was nearly empty. A few cars passed in the opposite lane, their lights blinking like brief ghosts before fading into the dark. My hands rested tight on the steering wheel, the skin along my knuckles pale against the leather. The heater hummed, but I still felt cold. Maybe it wasn't the kind of cold you could fix with warm air. The smell of wine and roasted turkey lingered faintly on my coat. I rolled the window down just a little, letting the winter air cut through it sharp and clean. It carried the faint scent of pine and smoke, the kind of smell that used to mean home. My thoughts drifted back to other Christmas nights, smaller ones, softer ones. I was 8, standing on a stool to hang a glass ornament on the tree. It slipped from my hand and shattered. I hadn't even touched it wrong. Ellie had bumped my elbow trying to hang hers higher, but Mom's voice had come sharp and quick. "Sarah, I told you to be careful. Why can't you ever pay attention?" Ellie cried. I said nothing. Dad turned up the TV volume, and I swept up the pieces while Mom sighed over the mess. The radio shifted to another carol, "Oh, Holy Night," and the singer's voice cracked a little on the high note. I almost laughed. Maybe every family had cracks. Mine just learned to pretend they were patterns. Somewhere past Loveland, I pulled into a gas station. The fluorescent lights buzzed, turning the snow in the parking lot a strange, sterile blue. I filled the tank even though I didn't need to, mostly, for something to do with my hands. Inside the small store, a young woman at the counter wore a red Santa hat, humming as she handed a receipt to a man with 2 kids. The little girl clutched a cup of hot cocoa, her cheeks flushed pink. Her brother had a candy cane stuck in his mouth, grinning up at their father. The sound of their laughter hit me harder than the cold. It wasn't envy exactly, just a kind of quiet wonder. Maybe some families just knew how to love. Mine only knew how to judge. Back in the car, I stared at my phone on the passenger seat. 1 missed call from Mom. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. I imagined her voice if she answered. Soft, rehearsed, dripping with that tone she used when she thought she was being kind. "You overreacted, honey. It was just a joke. It always was until it wasn't." Still, a part of me wanted to hear her. So I pressed call. It rang twice before I ended it. The line didn't need to connect for me to hear what she'd say. I dropped the phone back on the seat and leaned my head against the steering wheel. Outside, the wind picked up and snowflakes hit the glass in tiny, frantic patterns. By the time I reached Boulder, the city lights were dim behind the falling snow. My apartment complex sat at the end of a quiet street lined with leafless trees. The driveway was slick, the pavement half hidden beneath a thin layer of ice. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, listening to the engine's last hum fade into stillness. Inside, the air felt colder than outside. I kicked off my boots and dropped my coat over the chair. The place was small but clean. Beige walls, wooden floors, a single framed sketch of a house I'd designed years ago. I turned on the lamp beside the couch, its light spilling warm and soft across the room. The silence wrapped around me like a blanket. For the first time all night, I could breathe. I opened a bottle of Merlot and poured a glass, the liquid catching the light like dark velvet. On the kitchen counter sat a small plate of leftover cookies I'd baked the night before, more out of habit than joy. I broke one in half and ate it slowly, tasting nothing. On the coffee table, a stack of mail waited untouched. Bills, flyers, a few holiday cards. I flipped through them until one caught my eye. A cream envelope, handwritten. It was from one of my clients, a couple whose restaurant I'd redesigned in Denver earlier that year. Inside a card read, "To Sarah, for always delivering with care. Thank you for bringing light into our space." I stared at it for a long moment, tracing the gold letters with my thumb. It was a simple note, but it filled the room in a way the music and candles never could. Someone saw me. Someone noticed. I leaned back on the couch, the card still in my hand. Outside, snow kept falling, dusting the windows in white. The streetlights glowed faintly through it, making the world look softer than it really was. I thought about the dinner table, the way my mother's words sliced through the laughter like a dull knife. I thought about Ellie's smirk, my father's quiet nod, and the empty chair I'd left behind. They would wake up tomorrow, unwrap presents, maybe even call me to smooth it over, pretend none of it happened. They always did, but something had shifted tonight. I took another sip of wine, feeling the burns spread slowly through my chest. For once, I didn't feel guilty for being alone. Maybe it's time to stop delivering care to those who never deserved it. The thought came quietly like a truth that had been waiting for the right night to surface. I set the empty glass down, turned off the lamp, and stood at the window. Snowflakes drifted past the glass, catching the dim glow of the streetlight. In their soft, silent fall, I saw something I hadn't in years. An ending that finally looked like a beginning. Morning came slow and gray. The light leaking through the curtains was thin, cold, the kind that made everything look softer, but not warmer. My apartment smelled faintly of coffee and last night's wine. The snow outside had stopped, leaving a pale crust of ice along the edges of the windows. I sat at the kitchen table in my robe laptop, open, cursor blinking against a white screen like it was waiting for me to make a decision. I typed in my password and opened my online banking. The numbers stared back at me, my checking, my savings, and at the bottom the account that had been quietly bleeding me dry for years. Joint family account. I'd created it when I was 25, back when Dad lost his accounting job, and Mom said, "We'll pay you back when things settle." They never did. For 6 years I transferred 1/3 of every paycheck into that account, pretending it was love instead of obligation. I scrolled through the transactions, mortgage payments, utility bills, even the insurance on the car I'd bought for Mom because hers wasn't safe anymore. Every line a reminder of the version of me they liked. The daughter who provided but didn't speak. The coffee had gone cold. I took a sip anyway. It tasted bitter, but not worse than the realization that I had funded their peace while mine was rotting. I clicked transfer. A box popped up asking for confirmation. Move $38, $426.17 to personal account. My fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Not out of doubt, just habit. Then I pressed confirm. A soft electronic chime filled the silence. It didn't sound like money moving. It sounded like air returning to my lungs. I stared at the empty balance on their side of the screen. I wasn't angry. Not really. The anger had burned out long ago. What was left was something colder, cleaner. A decision. I opened a new email and began to type. Subject: You got what you wanted. Mom, I wrote you wished for a life without me. Congratulations. Starting today, you have it. No sign-off. No love. No bitterness. Just the truth in its simplest form. I hit send. I closed the laptop and leaned back in my chair. The quiet of the apartment settled around me. Outside, the world was still pale and still, but something inside me had shifted. My phone buzzed against the table. The screen lit up with Ellie's name. I almost didn't look, but curiosity won. Mom's upset. Why do you always overreact? I stared at the message, the words neat and careless. For a second, I imagined her sitting in their kitchen comforting Mom with that easy empathy she always reserved for the wrong people. Then I placed the phone face down and didn't respond. They call it overreacting when you finally react at all. I said the thought aloud without meaning to, and the sound of my own voice startled me. I hadn't spoken to anyone since last night. It felt strange hearing something come out that wasn't an apology. The phone buzzed again, this time a voicemail notification from Mom. I didn't listen to it. I didn't need to. I already knew it would start with "Sweetheart." We didn't mean it that way. It always did. I pushed the phone away and opened the laptop again. There was one more thing to do. I found the contact information for First Horizon Bank, the one that held the home improvement loan I'd co-signed for last year, when their roof started leaking. Back then, the banker had smiled at me like I was the dependable one, and I'd played along. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice professional and kind. "This is Michelle with First Horizon. How can I help you today?" "Yes," I said, steady. I need to remove myself as co-signer on a home repair loan, under the names Robert and Linda Harris. There was a short pause as she typed. May I ask why I'm no longer responsible for that property or the homeowners? She hesitated. Understood. Just to confirm, you're removing yourself from co-signer status. Yes, I said, permanently. She processed the request, explaining the steps, the paperwork that would follow. I thanked her. Hung up and stared at the laptop screen again. Each small act felt like cutting another invisible rope. When it was done, I stood and walked to the window. The morning had brightened, if you could call it that. The snow on the trees had started to drip in slow, rhythmic patterns, like the world was thawing one flake at a time. I pulled the curtains aside and leaned my forehead against the cold glass. Across the street, a neighbor was shoveling his driveway, his little boy tossing handfuls of snow at him, laughing. The man pretended to be annoyed, but smiled anyway. It was such an ordinary moment, and for some reason it made my chest ache. I thought about how much of my life had gone into keeping everyone else's house standing, paying bills that weren't mine, apologizing for things I didn't do, keeping peace in rooms that had none to begin with. Maybe that was my real mistake, believing I had to earn belonging. The phone buzzed once more, one final attempt from home. I watched it vibrate across the counter until it stopped. The silence that followed felt steady, almost kind. I went to the kitchen, poured the rest of the coffee down the sink, and refilled the mug with water. My reflection in the window looked tired, but lighter somehow. Not happy yet, but unburdened. For the first time in years, I didn't have a plan, a timeline, or a next step. Just space. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and a pale line of sunlight slipped through, touching the edge of the window frame. The ice started to melt faster now. Tiny droplets running down the glass. I watched them gather, merge, and disappear into the sill. Freedom doesn't always arrive with noise. Sometimes it's just a faint shimmer of light on a cold morning asking if you're ready to see it. I stood there a little longer, the warmth of the sun barely brushing my hands, and whispered to no one, I think I am. A week passed before the first cracks appeared. I didn't have to look for them. They found me. It started on a Tuesday morning, an email from my old bank flashing across my screen. Notification, automatic payment canceled. I stared at it for a moment, the corners of my mouth lifting just slightly. Nothing dramatic, just that quiet satisfaction of finally unplugging something that had been draining you for years. Across the state in Fort Collins, I could almost picture it happening. The phone ringing in my parents' kitchen, the tremor in my mother's voice as she answered. Mrs. Harris. This is First National Mortgage. Your auto payment failed to process this month. A long silence, then the brittle edge of panic. That can't be right. My daughter handles that. I didn't need to hear the rest to know how it went. She would blame my father first. She always did. And Dad, sitting at the table with his coffee, would shrug the same tired way he'd been shrugging since the 90s. Maybe Jennifer stopped sending money, he'd say. And Emily, of course Emily would jump in loud and certain, because she couldn't stand the quiet. She's just jealous, Mom. Don't let her ruin Christmas for you. It was mid-morning when my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. Mom calling. I didn't answer. 10 seconds later it buzzed again. Mom calling. By the 15th time the sound had blended into the hum of the heater, a background noise I barely registered anymore. I slipped on my coat and stepped outside. The snow had turned to a thin glaze of ice that crunched under my boots. The air was clear, sharp enough to sting my lungs. I walked down Pearl Street, where the shop windows were still dressed for the holidays. Fake snow, blinking lights, smiling mannequins in red scarves. Inside a small florist's shop, a woman was arranging poinsettias by the window. I stopped when I saw a miniature pine tree sitting in a silver pot, its needles dusted with real snow from the delivery truck. It was only 2 feet tall, a little crooked, but something about it felt honest. How much for the little one, I asked. She smiled. Half off post-holiday sale. I paid in cash, carried it out carefully, and walked home through the quiet streets. The tree's scent filled the cold air. A clean, sharp kind of green that cut through the stale taste of everything else. Back at the apartment, I set it on the kitchen counter and plugged in a short strand of lights. They blinked unevenly, one bulb already flickering, but I liked it that way. Imperfect light still counted. The phone buzzed again, vibrating across the table until it hit the salt shaker and stopped. I didn't pick it up. Peace doesn't always come quietly. Sometimes it echoes through their panic. The thought drifted through my mind as I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window. Outside, a delivery truck backed into the lot, a man shouting directions through the falling snow. Somewhere, a dog barked. Ordinary life went on untouched. I wondered what was happening in Fort Collins now. Maybe Mom had called the bank again, her voice sharp defensive. Maybe she was pacing the living room, clutching the cordless phone, saying things like, "We raised her better than this." Maybe Dad had gone silent, retreating behind his newspaper the way he always did when the storm was one he couldn't control. And maybe, just maybe, Emily had decided to stop pretending to understand me and joined in the chorus of blame. It was easier that way. For them, at least. That afternoon, I took the trash out to the alley behind the building. The wind bit through my sweater, and snow started again, lazy flakes spinning down. I saw a couple across the street laughing as they loaded groceries into their car, brushing snow from each other's shoulders. The sight didn't make me sad anymore. It just reminded me that not every family was built to last, and that was okay. Later that day, I learned what happened next through a voicemail I didn't intend to hear. The message began mid-sentence, Mom's voice high and breathless. Ridiculous. They said the car isn't insured. I told the officer it was a mistake, but he gave me a ticket anyway. "Sarah, I can't afford this right now, and your name is still on that registration. Call me back." I stood in the kitchen, the little pine tree glowing beside me, listening to the hum of the fridge as her words played out. I didn't replay it. I didn't delete it either. It just stayed there like a museum piece from a life I no longer lived. Outside, the sun dipped below the buildings, and the sky turned the color of slate. I lit a candle on the counter. The flame flickered weakly at first, then steadied. For dinner, I made pasta with olive oil, and garlic simple and quiet. I sat at the table alone, the small lights of the tree reflecting off the wine glass. It was the first time in years that I'd had a meal without feeling like I owed anyone something for it. Somewhere far away, my family was falling apart. Bills piling up, tempers rising, voices cracking. I could picture Mom's hands shaking as she tried to dial me again. Dad looking out the window, pretending he didn't hear Emily muttering, "She'll come around," but I wasn't coming around this time. When the last of the candle melted into a small pool of wax, I blew it out and sat in the darkness for a moment. The room smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Through the window, I could see the reflection of the little lights on my tree blinking unevenly but stubbornly bright. 2 homes, 2 worlds. One filled with noise and breaking glass, the other silent, except for the sound of the snow tapping softly against the window. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to fix anything. I didn't feel responsible. I just watched the lights flicker until the room blurred, until the only thing left was quiet. By February, the silence had started to crack. It came first as a letter slipped through my mailbox. Official heavy paper, my name printed in bold at the top. I tore it open already, half dreading, half knowing what it would say. Notice of verification. Mortgage application under your name. Pending review. My stomach tightened as I skimmed the paragraphs. The words blurred together, but the meaning was sharp enough. My mother had tried to take out another loan, using my name, my signature. I leaned against the counter, the letter trembling just slightly in my hand. "She really did it," I said aloud, though there was no one to hear me. For a long minute I just stood there, letting the cold air from the window cut across my back. I wasn't angry, not the way I used to be. The anger had burned itself out, somewhere between the 15th missed call and the first night I slept without guilt. What was left now was something quieter. Sadness, maybe. Disbelief, so heavy it felt calm. I poured myself a glass of water, set it down untouched, and picked up my phone. My lawyer's number was still saved from the last time I helped my parents refinance their home, back when I thought doing so meant being a good daughter. He answered on the second ring. "Sarah, hi. It's been a while. I got a notice," I said, keeping my voice level. "There's a mortgage application in my name. I didn't file it." A pause. Then his tone shifted, less friendly, more careful. "Do you know who did?" "My mother?" I said quietly. "I'm certain." "Then you'll need to file a formal statement of non-involvement immediately. If you stay silent, the bank could assume you're complicit." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "I'll come to Denver tomorrow." After we hung up, I sat down on the couch and stared at the ceiling. The heater clicked on, filling the room with dry warmth. My thoughts felt cold anyway. They'd turned love into debt. That sentence kept looping in my head like a song I didn't want to remember. All those years of transferring money, of telling myself I was helping. Had it only taught them that I'd always clean up their messes? That my name was theirs to use by the time I arrived in Denver the next afternoon. The sky had gone gray again, the kind of color that made the whole world look paused. My lawyer Mark greeted me with a handshake that felt more like a warning. He walked me through the statement, dry legal language signature lines, fine print about fraud and identity protection. When I signed, he glanced up from the desk. "Do you want to press charges?" "No," I said. "I just want it stopped." He hesitated. "Sarah, they forged your name on a federal loan document. That's not a mistake. That's criminal." I met his eyes. "I know, but I'm not going to be the one who ruins them." He sighed but didn't argue. Maybe he saw the kind of exhaustion that doesn't leave room for revenge. Back in Boulder that evening, I made tea and sat by the window watching the streetlights blink on one by one. A light snow had started again. The steam from my cup fogged the glass, and for a second I saw my reflection double. A ghost of the woman I used to be, the one who still believed family was a safety net instead of a trap. Somewhere in Fort Collins, another letter was being opened. I could almost picture it, my mother's hands shaking as she read the notice from the credit bureau. The words "investigation pending" underlined in bold. She'd probably drop the paper. Her voice rising as she called for my father. He'd come into the room, slow, cautious, like a man approaching a live wire. "What did you do, Linda?" he'd ask. Though he already knew, she'd snap back. "Don't start with me, Robert. She's exaggerating this. It's not fraud if she's family." Emily would walk in halfway through the fight, still dressed from one of her writing workshops, rolling her eyes. "Mom, please calm down. You're making it worse." And then maybe when she tried to apply for another small business loan that same week, she'd find out her name was flagged for risk review. The bank would turn her down politely, firmly. The same way the world turns down people who think they can live on other people's credit forever. I didn't need to imagine the phone calls that followed. I knew the pattern: panic first, then blame. The news spread fast in small towns. 2 days later, a friend from high school. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years sent me an email. "Hey, Sarah, I don't mean to stir anything up, but your mom's name is all over town. Something about forged documents. Are you okay?" I read it twice before deleting it. People always said, "Are you okay?" when what they really wanted was the story. The local paper confirmed it the next morning: Fort Collins couple under investigation for forged mortgage application. A short article buried between community events and weather forecasts. No names, but enough details that anyone who mattered could fill in the blanks. I folded the paper and set it aside. Outside, snow was falling again, thicker this time, heavy flakes that drifted slowly through the glow of the street lamp. I stepped out onto the balcony, pulling my sweater tighter. The cold bit at my skin, sharp and real, but I stayed there anyway. Somewhere far away, the life I used to hold together was collapsing timber by timber. "Karma's just catching up." I whispered, my breath clouding in the air. The wind carried the words away before I could even hear them fade. The story broke quietly, not in newspapers this time, but on social media. I found out on a Monday morning while I was making coffee. My phone buzzed, and a former coworker had sent a message with a link. "Is this your sister?" I clicked before I could stop myself. There it was, a Facebook post from Emily Harris. Her profile picture was the two of us as kids, arms around each other, smiling in front of the same Christmas tree that still stood in my parents' living room. The caption above the photo read in bold, "My sister abandoned us for money." Beneath it, a long paragraph spilled out like an open wound. "She left when we needed her most. My parents are drowning in debt and she refuses to help. She's cold, heartless, and selfish. I don't even recognize her anymore." The post already had hundreds of reactions, sad face emojis, angry comments, hearts prayers. People loved tragedies as long as they weren't the ones bleeding in them. I scrolled slowly, my stomach tightening, but not breaking. Half the comments were strangers offering sympathy. "Stay strong," Emily, one woman, wrote. "Some people just forget their families." The other half weren't so sure. "Didn't your sister pay off your parents' mortgage for years?" another person asked. "She bought your mom a car, right?" someone else added. And then a name I recognized, our old neighbor from Fort Collins. I remember Sarah driving to their house every month to fix something, or pay for something. Maybe she finally got tired. The comments under that one grew fast arguments spinning like a storm. I read it all in silence. No anger, no defense, just a strange calm. I printed the post not because I needed proof of anything, but because it felt like a record. One more artifact of who they had chosen to become. When the paper slid warm from the printer, I folded it neatly and placed it in the top drawer of my desk. proof that silence speaks louder. The next day, while Fort Collins buzzed with gossip, my world in Boulder moved in perfect stillness. I had a class to teach that morning, an online seminar for design students from across the country. My laptop camera framed only the top half of my living room wall, where light from the window stretched in long stripes across the pale paint. "Good morning," I said, smiling at the grid of young faces on my screen. "Today we're talking about light, how it moves through space, how it changes the way people feel." Their pens began to move. The chat box blinked with questions. "Does color temperature really affect emotion?" One student asked. "It does." I said, "Warm light brings comfort. Cold light sharpens attention. But too much of either can distort what's real. Balance is the hardest part." I didn't plan to, but as I spoke, I found myself thinking about my family, how I'd lived in the harsh glare of their approval for years, mistaking it for warmth. Behind me, the small pine tree still sat on the table, the same one I'd bought after everything started to unravel. Its lights flickered softly uneven, but alive. Design, I continued, isn't just about beauty. It's about honesty. A room that lies. One that tries too hard to look perfect. Always feels off, even if you can't explain why. One of the students smiled at that. "Kind of like people," she said. "Exactly," I replied. "You can't build something stable on a false foundation." Halfway through the lesson, my phone lit up again. I didn't need to check to know it was from home. Calls came in waves now. My mother, my father, then Emily. Sometimes they alternated. Sometimes it was all three at once. The noise of their desperation had become a rhythm I no longer moved to. Some people destroy their homes with lies. Others rebuild one with truth. That thought came to me the same way the light did, slow, natural, unforced. Later that day, while I worked on grading assignments, I received an email from a former classmate who still lived in Fort Collins. "Hey, it began. Things are getting messy back here. Your mom and dad are fighting nonstop. I heard shouting from outside last night. Are you okay?" I stared at the words a long time before typing back just one line. "I'm fine." Then I closed my laptop and stepped away. In my mind, I could see it. The kitchen where I'd once done homework, now filled with shouting instead of the hum of the old refrigerator. Dad's voice low and heavy. "You forged her signature, Diane. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Mom's voice breaking desperate. I was trying to save us. "You just sat there and watched." And Emily somewhere between them crying, her voice rising in sharp bursts. "You both ruined everything." The walls that had once held our Christmas dinners must have felt like they were shrinking, closing in, under the weight of their own noise. That night, I stayed up late, finishing design sketches for a client in Denver. The project was a remodel of a small counseling office. Lots of glass and soft natural light. The client had told me I want the space to make people feel safe. I smiled as I worked tracing lines, adjusting the dimensions of a skylight. Maybe that was all I'd ever been trying to do, make something safe somewhere light could enter. When I finally stood to stretch, the moon had climbed high. Its reflection stretched across my floor like silver thread. I turned off my desk lamp and let the glow from the window take over. In Fort Collins, the headlines were dying down, the gossip turning to whispers. My parents had become a cautionary tale, a conversation people lowered their voices for. Meanwhile, my world had gone quiet in the best way. The last thing I saw before bed was the reflection of the pine tree lights dancing faintly against the window pane. They flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft glow over the room. The storm was still out there somewhere, but it was no longer mine to weather. The air in Denver felt sharper than usual that morning, the kind of cold that seeps through your coat, no matter how tightly you button it. The sky was the color of unpolished glass, flat and pale. I parked across the street from my lawyer's office, a squat brick building wedged between a coffee shop and a print store, and sat for a minute with the engine running, watching my breath fog the windshield. Inside, the waiting room smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and old paper. Certificates lined the walls in neat black frames, each one announcing someone's success in small serif letters. Mark. My lawyer greeted me with his usual professional calm, though I noticed the tightness around his eyes. "Morning, Sarah," he said, gesturing for me to sit. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. He slid a file across the desk. Inside were photocopies, loan applications, bank statements, and my own signature at the bottom of one page. Only it wasn't mine. Your mother used your name on a second mortgage, he said carefully. We've confirmed it with the bank. They compared it to your previous records. The handwriting's similar, but it's not identical. I stared at the papers, my heart not racing, but sinking, like something heavy slipping underwater. She didn't even try to hide it, I murmured. Mark leaned forward slightly. Sarah, this isn't a family dispute anymore. If we don't act now, this becomes a felony. You need to protect yourself. I nodded, though it took effort. What do I have to do? I'll draft a formal statement of non-involvement. You'll sign and we'll send it to the mortgage lender and the state fraud department. It keeps your record clean. He pushed a single page toward me. I took the pen. My hand steady until the moment the nib touched paper. Then a tremor started. Small, almost invisible. As I signed my name, a memory flashed behind my eyes, sitting at the kitchen table years ago. My mother leaning over my shoulder while I filled out the paperwork for their first loan, her voice warm and proud. You're so responsible, Sarah. I don't know what we'd do without you. Now that same voice echoed like a blade sliding against glass. When it was done, I handed the page back. Mark placed it in the folder without looking up. You're doing the right thing, he said quietly. I wanted to believe that. By afternoon, I was on the train heading back to Boulder. The car was nearly empty, the sound of the tracks beneath us, a slow, rhythmic hum. Outside, fields stretched out under a thin layer of snow patched with dirt and frozen grass. The world looked clean from a distance, the way lies often do before they're examined too closely. I rested my forehead against the cold window. The motion blurred everything. The bare trees, the fences, the faint outlines of houses slipping past. It was strange how peaceful the world could look while your past was catching fire somewhere else. In Fort Collins, I imagined the scene unfolding almost on cue. The mail slot clattering, my mother bending down to pick up the thick envelope from the bank, her eyes scanning the letterhead before she tore it open. Notice of investigation regarding fraudulent use of identity. I could hear her gasp even from miles away. She would sit at the table, paper shaking in her hand, the smell of coffee turning bitter as it cooled. Then her voice rising the familiar pitch of panic. Robert, come here. You need to see this. My father would shuffle a newspaper still folded under his arm. He'd take one look, then rub a hand across his forehead. Linda, what did you do? I didn't do anything. She'd snap back, tears already gathering. She's doing this to punish us. She's making it look worse than it is. He'd slam the paper on the counter. You did this to yourself. The sound of their voices would fill the house, bouncing off the same walls that once held laughter, or something that resembled it. And maybe in another room Emily would hear the shouting, her stomach twisting. She'd try to calm Mom down, but the fear in her own voice would give her away. Mom, please, you have to fix this before it gets worse. But it already was worse. Back on the train, I watched the reflection of my face in the window. The passing light carved soft lines across my skin. I didn't look angry, just older somehow. Wiser, maybe. The truth doesn't destroy families. Lies do. The thought came without warning, landing gently, as if it had been waiting for me to say it out loud. By the time the train pulled into Boulder, dusk had started to settle. The air outside carried that late winter sharpness, cold, but with a hint of spring trying to push through. I walked home from the station, my breath forming small clouds that vanished behind me. In the apartment, everything was as I left it, quiet, orderly, untouched by chaos. I made tea, sat by the window, and let my body finally relax. The lights from the street cast faint stripes across the hardwood floor. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to. The calls would come soon enough, the same voices repeating the same words. This time I wouldn't answer. Somewhere far away in that house that used to be mine too. My mother must have been sitting at the table, with the letter still in her hand. I could picture the wine glass tipping red, spilling across the paper, bleeding into the printed words. Fraud investigation. Maybe she cried then. Maybe she didn't. But I knew one thing for sure. There are stains you can't scrub out no matter how hard you try. By early March, the house in Fort Collins had gone quiet. Half the lights stayed off now, as if even the electricity had decided it was done pretending. I heard later that Emily packed her things on a Wednesday morning while the snow was melting outside, heavy and gray. She didn't say goodbye. Mom stood at the bottom of the stairs crying, yet begging her to stay. promising things would get better. Dad didn't say anything at all. He just sat in his armchair staring at the muted TV. It must have been a strange silence after she left. No sound of her music upstairs, no clatter of her shoes in the hallway, no laughter forced enough to keep the walls from closing in. The house that once buzzed with noise now only carried the faint hum of the refrigerator and the clink of a bottle on the counter. I imagined my mother folding towels, just to keep her hands busy, watching the driveway for a car that wouldn't come back. She'd stopped answering calls from neighbors weeks ago. She couldn't stand the pity. "They're talking about us," she probably said. And she'd be right. Fort Collins wasn't a big town. People remembered. My father had found his own kind of silence. Bottoms of bottles, late-night TV reruns, and the heavy sound of nothing being fixed. Every evening he'd sit at the kitchen table staring at a half-full glass until it went warm. While their world dimmed, mine was slowly lighting up. In Boulder, the days grew longer. The sun came through the blinds earlier now, painting the walls with stripes of gold that shifted as the hours passed. I spent the weekend cleaning the apartment, wiping the last of the winter dust off the shelves. When I was done, I stood in the center of the living room barefoot, listening to the soft hum of the heater. On the wall above my desk, I hung a framed drawing, a sketch of a small wooden cabin I'd designed during grad school. I'd named it The Quiet House. Simple pine beams, wide windows, and a stone fireplace in the corner. Back then, it had been an assignment about functional minimalism. Now it looked more like a dream I hadn't realized was still waiting. The phone buzzed against the table, a soft vibration that cut through the stillness. I almost ignored it until I saw the sender, Professor Marshall, my mentor, from the University of Colorado, Sarah. The email began, "I'm starting a new program next semester. An elective called Emotional Architecture. It's about how light and space affect human behavior. Your name came to mind immediately. Would you be interested in teaching a section?" I read it twice, the corners of my lips tugging upward. For years I'd been designing for other people, offices, stores, homes that weren't mine. The thought of teaching something personal, something that had saved me, felt like breathing again. I wrote back before I could overthink it. Yes, I'd love to. That night, I sat on the couch with a cup of chamomile tea, laptop open, scrolling through the news I no longer feared. The post Emily had written about me was gone, deleted quietly like a mistake she hoped no one remembered. But the internet never forgets completely. A few comments lingered under a repost someone had made, the thread still alive but fading. "Maybe Sarah was right," one person wrote. "Sometimes the quiet one isn't cruel." Another said, "She's just done." I closed the laptop slowly. For the first time, seeing my name on a screen didn't sting. It felt neutral, almost peaceful, like the truth had settled on its own without my help. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm that finally made sense. Work, sleep, long walks through the thawing streets. I started cooking again, real meals instead of takeout. I bought tulips for the kitchen counter. Yellow ones that caught the sunlight just right. Once I tried calling my father. I don't even know why. Habit maybe, or some soft part of me that still wanted to hear his voice. The line rang 3 times before he picked up. "Dad," I said quietly. A long pause. Then a breath that sounded more like a sigh. "Sarah." His voice was older, somehow hollow. I waited for him to ask how I was to say anything that resembled care. But after a moment, there was only silence. Then a click. The line went dead. I sat there holding the phone, listening to the static echo that came after. As if even the network didn't know what to do with the silence we'd built. They once called me cold. Maybe peace just feels cold to those who only know chaos. That night, I stood by the window watching the snow melt into small rivers along the curb, streetlights reflected in the puddles like trembling stars. The world outside looked cleaner than it had in months, washed of the noise and guilt I'd carried for so long. I went to my desk and opened my laptop again. The cabin sketch stared back at me. The quiet house. I zoomed in on the small details, the slope of the roof, the angle of the windows, the little path leading up to the door. I'd drawn it overlooking a valley somewhere high enough to see the sunrise, without buildings in the way. Telluride. The name came to me without effort. I'd visited once during college for a design competition. The town had stayed in my mind. Snowy peaks, pine forests. and a kind of silence that didn't feel empty. Before I could talk myself out of it, I opened a travel site. The cursor blinked over the destination bar. Telluride, Colorado. A cabin for rent, small, but with large windows facing west. Available immediately. I clicked book. The confirmation email arrived seconds later. I stared at the screen at the words. Reservation confirmed. It didn't feel like running away. It felt like stepping towards something that had been calling my name all along. When I turned off the lights that night, the apartment glowed faintly in the amber hue of the street lamp outside. My bags weren't packed yet, but the decision had already been made. Somewhere between the darkness of Fort Collins and the soft gold of Boulder, I'd found the line between leaving and letting go. The drive to Telluride wound higher than I remembered. Snow still clung to the cliffs along the highway, catching the sunlight in shards of white. Every few miles the road curved, revealing another stretch of mountains. Blue, distant, endless. I rolled the window down just enough to feel the cold air, the scent of pine sharp and clean. By the time I reached town, the afternoon light had gone gold. Telluride was small, quiet, tucked into a valley like a secret. Main Street was lined with brick buildings and wooden porches, the kind of place where no one was in a hurry. A few locals were shoveling snow from storefronts, their breath visible in the air. The address on my rental agreement led me up a narrow road that wound through the pines. The tires crunched over the frozen dirt, and when I finally saw it, I almost laughed. The cabin looked exactly like the one I'd sketched years ago. Pine siding, a wide porch, and a chimney leaning just slightly to the left. A woman stepped out from the porch as I parked. She had silver hair, a wool sweater, and the kind of smile that made you feel like you'd met before. "You must be Sarah," she said. "Helen Carter." Her name hit me with a faint shock. Helen. "You used to live on Oak Street right in Fort Collins." She laughed softly. "That's right. And you were the girl who used to build forts in the backyard and draw houses in the dirt. I never forget creative kids." I felt something in my chest loosen. "I didn't realize this was your place. It's mine now, though. I spend most of my time in town. The cabin's quiet. It deserves someone who appreciates that." She handed me a brass key on a string of worn leather. "Keep it simple. Don't overheat the stove. The light switch sticks sometimes, but you'll figure it out." Inside, the air smelled of cedar and dust. Sunlight poured through the wide front window, flooding the wooden floor. The furniture was simple, a couch, a small table, a sauce that looked handmade. The fireplace was built from river stones, smooth and gray. When I set my bags down, a kind of stillness settled over me, not silence exactly, but peace. I ran my fingers along the wooden wall. The grain was warm under my touch, alive somehow. For the first time in months, I wasn't surrounded by memories of other people's needs. The space belonged to me, even if only for a while. That night, I lit a fire. The flames licked the stones filling the cabin with that soft, living sound wood makes when it catches. I opened my laptop on the table near the window. It was time for my first online lecture since moving. When the camera turned on, I saw my own face in the corner of the screen. Tired, calm, but different. The class logged in one by one squares of curious faces, students from different cities and time zones. "Good evening," I said. My voice echoed slightly against the wooden walls. "Tonight, we're talking about how architecture shapes emotion. Architecture isn't about walls. It's about the space where light can breathe." I turned the camera slightly toward the window. The glow from the fire met the pale snow outside, and the light bounced across the room. "This," I said, "is how light tells a story. Not through perfection, but through movement." One of the students wrote in the chat, "That's beautiful, Professor." I smiled. It's just the truth. After class, I closed the laptop and sat for a while, letting the fire die down. The quiet was thick, but comforting. I didn't feel alone. I felt intact. There was a soft knock on the door. It startled me at first. No one was supposed to know I was here yet. When I opened it, a man stood on the porch, holding a stainless steel kettle. Snow dusted his jacket and hair. "Sorry to bother you," he said, breath visible in the cold. "I just moved into the next cabin over. I was unpacking and realized my kettle's busted. Any chance I could borrow one?" He had kind eyes framed by the faint lines of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors. "Sure," I said. "Come in for a minute. It's freezing." He stepped inside, carefully stomping snow off his boots. "Thanks." I'm Eric. Sarah, I replied, handing him the kettle from the counter. You picked a good place to get snowed in. He laughed softly. Yeah, the light here's unreal. I'm a photographer. Came to shoot the winter storms before they're gone. I nodded toward his camera hanging at his side. Nature photographer, mostly landscapes. I chase light more than subjects. He smiled, eyes glancing at the glow of the fire. Guess we have that in common. For a moment we stood in comfortable silence, watching the flames shift colors. The room glowed amber around us. I'll bring this back tomorrow, he said, finally, lifting the kettle slightly. No rush, I told him. The store's 20 miles downhill. He grinned. That's what I figured. After he left, I made tea for myself, the sound of the kettle filling the quiet again. I poured the water into a chipped mug and sat by the window. Outside, snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes, blanketing the trees and the path leading to the porch. I could see faint light from Eric's cabin through the trees, one small, golden square in the darkness. For the first time, I wasn't running from them. I was walking toward myself. The fire crackled low. I finished my tea, stood up, and found a box I'd brought from Boulder, a tangle of old string lights I used to hang on my apartment balcony. I carried them out to the porch, my breath fogging in the air. One by one, I looped the lights around the railing, the bulbs faint but warm against the snow. When I plugged them in, the cabin glowed softly against the dark forest. A simple string of light, imperfect, but mine. I stood there until my fingers went numb, the wind brushing my hair across my face. Somewhere beyond the trees, an owl called out long and low. I listened to it echo through the cold air before turning back inside. The cabin felt different now. Not empty, just honest. I left the lights on as I climbed into bed, their reflection flickering against the ceiling. The snow kept falling slow and endless, erasing every old footprint outside my door. In Fort Collins, winter had overstayed its welcome. The snow no longer looked clean, just gray and heavy piled in uneven drifts against the curbs. Inside the house on Oak Street, the curtains stayed closed most of the day. The living room still held the same Christmas tree from months ago, dry needles scattered across the floor, its lights unplugged, since the day the power company called about an overdue bill. That morning, a letter came through the mail slot. My mother picked it up from the mat, already shaking before she opened it. The paper was thick, the ink too official to mistake for anything good. Notice of foreclosure and property seizure, it read. Her breath caught. The words blurred, but the meaning didn't. The house, the one she had called her pride, the proof of her family's success, was gone. She sat down on the couch, the paper trembling in her hands. When my father came in from the garage, wiping his palms on a rag, she handed him the notice without a word. He read it once, then twice. This can't be right. It's from the bank, she said, voice flat. His jaw tightened. No, there has to be something we can do. There isn't. He slammed the letter on the table. The old coffee cup next to it tipped, spilling over the edge. When the porcelain hit the floor, it shattered. For a second, the only sound in the room was the steady drip of coffee soaking into the carpet. Then came the breaking point. The glass he threw against the wall, the sound sharp and final. You and your damn loans, he shouted. You couldn't stop lying. My mother flinched but didn't stand. She just stared at the broken shards on the floor. Eyes empty. Later that afternoon, the phone rang. She hesitated, then answered. Mom. It was Emily. Her voice small, almost childlike. I saw something online. What's happening? Did they take the house? There was a pause, then my mother's voice. Hoarse, distant. Your sister destroyed this family. Before Emily could say another word, the line went dead. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, I was sitting at the small wooden table in my cabin, answering work emails when the message came. Subject. Thought you should know. It was from a neighbor in Fort Collins, someone who'd known my parents for years. Hi, Sarah. I'm sorry to hear this, but your parents' house has been repossessed. The sheriff's office was there this morning. They're saying the bank's taking over next week. I stared at the words for a long moment. The snow outside the window glowed faintly under the mid-morning light. I typed a short reply. Thank you for letting me know. That was all. The cursor blinked at the end of the sentence, as if waiting for something more, but there was nothing left to say. Outside, Eric was stacking firewood by the porch. I watched him for a moment before slipping on my boots and stepping out. The cold hit like a clean blade, but it felt good, honest at least. He looked up as I joined him. Hey, he said, brushing snow from his gloves. The door's sticking again. I think the hinges need oil. We carried the toolbox inside, setting it down by the front door. He knelt beside the frame, testing the screws. You mind handing me that screwdriver? I passed it to him, the metal cold against my fingers. He worked quietly for a few minutes, the steady scrape of the tool the only sound between us. When he finally straightened, the door moved smoothly on its hinges again. Fixed, he said, smiling. Thank you, I murmured, resting against the wall. The light from the window caught in his hair, a soft gold halo against the dark wood behind him. He watched me for a moment. You've been quiet today. I got some news from Fort Collins. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew what kind of news it was. Do you miss them? I thought about the question. The answer came slowly, like something being unearthed. I miss the idea of them, I said. He didn't press. Instead, he just nodded once and began packing up the tools. We worked in silence again, side by side, until everything was back in its place. When he left, the cabin felt too still. I poured a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and watched the wind push snow down from the branches. It wasn't joy that I felt, not satisfaction, not vindication. Just a quiet ache, clear and sharp, like grief stripped of sentiment. Sometimes peace feels like mourning someone who's still alive. The sun dipped lower, throwing long blue shadows across the snow. I turned away from the window and opened my laptop. A list of unread emails filled the screen. One near the bottom caught my eye. An old message from my mother sent almost 2 years ago. Subject: Advice from your mother. I clicked it open. The words were familiar before I even read them. You're always too serious, Sarah. Lighten up a little. You work too hard. Don't forget to smile. I stared at the paragraph until the lines began to blur. The irony felt almost gentle. I hovered over the delete button for a second, then pressed it. The screen went blank. No sound, no fanfare, just absence. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and the snow kept falling. Soft, steady, uncaring. By late winter, the snow in Telluride had begun to melt. It slid from the rooftops in slow, quiet sheets, and pooled beneath the trees, where tiny blades of green were starting to push through. The air smelled like pine sap and thawing earth, that tender mix between seasons, when the world seems to breathe again. I was finishing a sketch at the table when I heard the knock. 3 gentle raps against the door, followed by a muffled voice. Mail delivery. I wiped my hands and opened the door. The postman, a middle-aged man in a wool cap, smiled politely and held out a cream-colored envelope. No return address, but it looks personal. It was heavier than I expected. My name written across the front in familiar slanted handwriting. The ink bled slightly where tears or coffee had touched it. My breath caught before I even realized it. Thank you, I said softly. He tipped his hat. Have a good afternoon, ma'am. When the door closed, I just stood there for a moment, the envelope trembling slightly in my hands. I recognized that handwriting before I even let myself believe it, my mother's. I sat down at the table, the fire crackling quietly behind me, and slid my thumb under the flap. The paper inside was thin, slightly wrinkled, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. 3 pages written in the same, uneven hand. The first word stopped me cold. Jennifer, my daughter. If you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to call. My fingers tightened around the edge of the letter. I took a deep breath and began to read. We thought control was love. I see now it was fear. For years I told myself I was shaping you into someone strong, but what I really did was make you small so I could feel big. You were never the problem, Jennifer. We were. The words blurred for a moment, but not from tears. Just the weight of them, how simple and late they were. I don't have excuses. Your father barely speaks now. He sits by the window and watches the road like he's waiting for you to drive home again. Ellie moved to California. We don't talk much. I think she's angry with both of us. Maybe she has every right to be. The house is gone. So is the noise. For the first time I can hear what I did. The ink smudged in places where her hand must have trembled. I told myself I was protecting you, but I was protecting my pride. I used shame like a weapon, and you endured it so quietly that I mistook it for strength. I see now it was survival. I'm sorry for every dinner where I made you feel like a guest in your own home. I'm sorry for every time I laughed when you were the only one not laughing. And I'm sorry that it took losing you to understand the damage I caused. I stopped reading and looked out the window. The snow outside was bright, almost blinding the mountains sharp against the pale blue sky. The fire cracked behind me, the sound filling the silence like punctuation. I turned back to the last page. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you know I finally see it. Even if you never write back, I need you to know this one thing: I love you. Not because of what you did, not because of what you gave. I love you because you were the only one brave enough to walk away. I wish I had been as strong. The last line was smaller, like a whisper caught mid-breath. Be happy, Jennifer, even if it's without us. I stared at those words until the ink almost seemed to move. My hands were steady, my heart wasn't. I folded the pages carefully and set them on the table. The tears didn't come. They didn't need to. Instead, I exhaled slowly, the air leaving my chest in one long, uneven stream. I could still hear her voice, sharp, proud, so certain of her righteousness, that night at the dinner table. The clink of silverware, the laughter the moment everything inside me went quiet. The memory flashed, and then faded like a match burning out. Now there was only the hum of the wind outside, and the soft creak of the wooden walls. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just stops it from bleeding. I stood and crossed the room to the small dresser where I kept a wooden box. Inside were a few things I couldn't bring myself to throw away: a photograph of the four of us in the apple orchard behind our old house, a concert ticket from college, and the note my father once left on my graduation day that simply said, "Proud." I placed the letter on top of them, then closed the lid gently. Not locked, just shut. The sunlight shifted across the floor, landing on the edge of the table, where her words still lay. For the first time, they didn't hurt. They just existed like fossils of something that had once been alive, but no longer needed to be touched. I stepped out onto the porch. The snow was thinning now, patches of brown earth visible beneath the trees. The air was crisp, smelling faintly of pine and smoke from a neighbor's chimney. I looked toward the mountains, their peaks glowing under the late afternoon sun, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace, pure and simple. Not because the past had vanished, but because it no longer had the power to own me. Somewhere far away in a town I no longer called home, a woman I once feared had written 3 pages that proved she was still capable of love. That was enough. I closed my eyes, breathed in the cold air, and let it settle deep inside me. Soft, quiet, unbroken. Spring came to Telluride softly, almost shyly. The snow retreated one ridge at a time, revealing patches of green that grew bolder with each passing week. The cabin no longer looked buried. It looked alive. The wood glowed in the morning sun, and the air smelled of pine and damp soil. Birds had returned to the forest, their songs filling the space that winter had kept quiet for so long. Inside, the sound of hammering echoed through the small studio. Eric stood on a ladder fitting the last frame of a skylight, while I painted the edge of the new sign we'd hung outside. Lumen Atelier. The name had been his idea, a blend of lumen and atelier, light and workshop. When I asked him what it meant to him, he'd said, "It's the place where broken things glow again." I couldn't think of a better definition. We'd spent months shaping the space into something simple but warm. A long wooden table for classes, a few easels and workbenches, shelves filled with jars of brushes, and paper small sculptures and photographs. Every morning when sunlight poured through the new skylight, it caught on the edges of the glass jars and scattered across the room like water. The first group of students arrived one chilly afternoon in April. There were 5 of them, all women, all carrying stories in their faces before they ever spoke. A widow from Durango, who hadn't painted in 20 years. A nurse from Denver recovering from burnout. A young mother who had lost custody of her son. They came not because they wanted to make art, but because they needed a place where silence didn't feel like punishment. When class began, I didn't start with design or structure. I started with light. "Let's begin with something simple," I said. "Draw where the light touches first. Don't draw objects. Draw what they illuminate." They looked uncertain, but one by one they began to move their pencils across paper. As they worked, the sound of graphite filled the space. Soft, steady healing. At the end of the session, one of them asked quietly, "How did you learn this way of teaching?" I smiled, glancing toward the window. "A Christmas dinner," I said, "one that changed everything." Their faces waited, curious but kind. I didn't tell them everything, only enough. About a family that mistook control for love. About how silence can sometimes be louder than shouting. About how walking away isn't cruelty, it's survival. I wasn't bitter when I spoke. The words felt like they belonged to someone older, someone who had already forgiven the younger version of herself for staying too long. When I finished, there was a kind of stillness in the room, but not the painful kind. It was the quiet of understanding. After class, Eric helped me clean the tables. He'd been photographing the workshop from the corner, capturing the sunlight, the face, the unspoken moments. They listened, he said softly. I think they saw a piece of themselves in it, I replied. He smiled, setting down his camera. That's what healing looks like, light bouncing from one person to another. Later that week, a letter arrived from Fort Collins. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar, until I noticed the small return address written in the corner. Helen Carter, the woman who had once rented me this cabin, the one who'd known my family decades ago. I opened it at the table, the air still warm from afternoon sun. Dear Jennifer, it read. I thought you should know your parents have moved out of town. No one's heard from them since the foreclosure. They left quietly, no goodbyes, no forwarding address. I think they just wanted to disappear. I hope this brings you some peace, or at least some closure. I read the words twice, then folded the letter carefully and set it aside. There was no shock, no anger, just the soft ache of finality, like the closing of a door I no longer needed to open. Outside, the sky had begun to turn pink, the light falling across the ridges like spilled wine. I stepped onto the porch, where the first buds of spring flowers pushed through the melting snow. Eric was stacking logs near the fence. He looked up when he saw me. Bad news, he asked. No, I said, watching the horizon. Just the end of a story. He nodded, understanding without another word. That night, after he went inside, I stayed on the porch. The forest around me was quiet, except for the wind moving gently through the pines. I reached up and flipped the switch for the string of Christmas lights I'd hung months ago when I first arrived. One by one, the bulbs flickered to life, soft yellow against the dark. They traced the edge of the roof reflected in the snowmelt, shimmered faintly against the window glass. I leaned against the railing, arms crossed, breathing in the cool night air. Those lights had once been a symbol of defiance, proof that I could create my own warmth in the cold. Now they were something else. Proof that I'd learned how to live without needing to fight the dark at all. I thought of my students, the way they'd smiled today, and how I'd smiled back without hesitation. I thought of my mother's trembling handwriting, my father's silence, the sister I used to chase approval from. And for the first time, none of it hurt. The past had become a story I could tell without breaking. Sometimes peace is the loudest revenge. Sometimes the family you lose makes room for the one you build. The wind brushed past, lifting a strand of my hair across my face. I smiled and let it fall back into place. The cabin glowed behind me, warm, golden, alive. I turned off the porch light, but left the Christmas lights on. From a distance, they would look like a cluster of stars caught in the branches. I stayed there until the air grew colder, listening to the hum of the forest, the crackle of firewood inside, and the faint laughter of a world that no longer needed fixing. When I finally stepped inside, I closed the door gently, leaving the glow outside to keep watch. And in that quiet, I realized that the story that had begun at one dinner table had finally found its ending. Not in anger, but in light. Thank you for listening. If you've ever walked away from what broke you, or if you're learning to build peace from your own silence, tell me where you are watching from. Maybe tonight, somewhere between our stories, we'll find a little more light together.